Well, hiya, BookTube. Bill Ruttenberg here with the Ruttenberg Library. Wanted to come to you and have a book chat about the book In the Hurricane's Eye, The Genius of George Washington and the Victory at Yorktown by Nathaniel Philbrick. Recently read this book. It was a good book. It is from Viking Press, and it is a 2018 book. I was really excited to pick this up. This was actually a birthday present from my wife. It was a surprise present. I did not see this one coming. She got this off my list and did not tell me about it. So that was a pleasant surprise for my birthday in October. Pretty cool book. These are the end pages. Show you a couple things with the book here. That was the end pages. It's got full illustrations. Now these are black and white illustrations. There's no color to any of the paintings. The only problem, and I love paintings. I love seeing all these old pictures so that I can visualize these characters that they talk about, that any author talks about in their writings. And so the only problem I had with these paintings is in my copy of the book. I'm not saying this is every copy. This is probably just my copy. But if you look, the print, I don't know if you can see it there, it looks like Thomas Jefferson has smallpox or chicken pox or something. But the print did not come out very well on my pictures, and that kind of annoyed me. Like I said, that might not be every book. Here's one of Cornwallis. You can see kind of the speckles on his jacket. Pretty easy to see. That kind of annoyed me because I like to look at the pictures. It's I constantly go back so that I can visualize this, but you can't have everything. There were two chunks of pictures here. One talked primarily about the men in the beginning, and the second chunk talks about the guys at the end. I won't go through and show you all the pictures, but they also had some real good naval battles, pictures of naval battles. But anyway, let's tell you a little bit about the story. So this is the story of Yorktown. Nathaniel Philbrick does an awesome job of describing the naval side of the battle. I was real excited to get this because I was thinking Yorktown. I thought there was going to actually be a lot more about the battle itself. Now, the battle itself only took up a chapter or two at the very end of the book, or actually about one chapter at the end of the book. And that happened to be my favorite chapter of the entire book, was the one on the Battle of Yorktown itself. But the majority of this book is about the naval, the preparations and the naval battles, the Battle of the Chesapeake itself. And it was very good. It's an area that I am not real strong in, and I got to be honest, I got to go back and reread this. I got to reread the first part of this book where it talks about the naval stuff, because not only does it talk about the naval battles themselves, but it also talks about all the politics that was going on with the admirals, the British admirals and the French admirals at this time period. He does an excellent job of talking about the rivalries. I have read over and over about the rivalries between George Washington, Horatio Gates, and Charles Lee. I've read over and over about those, but I have not dipped into the rivalries of the admirals on both sides of the fight. And this was all brand new information to me, and it is foreign territory. Literally and figuratively. It's foreign territory for me. So I do need to go back and reread the first 3 quarters of this book and take some a little bit better notes. But the very last 2 chapters were my favorite chapters of the book, where they talk about the Battle of Yorktown and then the legacy of the battle, basically what comes after that. Let me read a few captions here, not captions, but portions here. let's see. In one of the parts here in the book, Nathaniel Philbrick does an awesome job of with his descriptions of the battle, and he talks about there's this wonderful episode here where when they go to fire the cannons, Washington goes to fire off the very first cannon, and the cannonball goes through town, blasts through this house, kills this guy that's sitting here. Let's see. It says my note was it was killing the British Commissary General, and at the same table at a dinner party there when this happened was General Cornwallis. And you think about stuff like that, this bombardment, and when they go into town, they talk about everything that happened to the town of Yorktown. And these cannonballs blasting through, they didn't just go into a house and stop. A lot of times these cannonballs blasted through the house, through the front, out the back, and then went skipping on through town, hitting other parts of the town, and killing guys all along the way. They also talk about there was even instances where the cannonball ripped through town and it was going at such a high speed that it skipped across the water and hit some of the boats. So this bombardment was devastating to the British that were in town. I'd like to read this description of the bombardment. I thought it was a wonderful description. It says, there were more than 6,000 British and German soldiers, along with hundreds, if not thousands, of escaped slaves, cooped up in a space just 500 yards wide and 1,200 yards long, with the beach at their backs and a steep bluff between them and the front of their fortifications. There were few places to hide as the Allied cannonballs and bombshells rained down on them over the course of the afternoon and evening. A cannonball could do more than its share of damage as it ricocheted through the town, and in some cases skipped across the water before crashing into the sides of the ships anchored off the beach. But it was the bombshells, huge open-mouthed orbs of iron filled with gunpowder and other combustibles and fired from the mortars in high, lazy arcs, that wreaked the most havoc. I followed with my eye in its parabolic path the slow, destructive bomb, a French chaplain recounted, sometimes burying itself in the roofs of the houses, sometimes when it burst, raising clouds of dust and rubbish from the ruins of the buildings, and at other times blowing the unfortunate wretches that happened to be within its reach, more than 20 feet high in the air, and letting them fall at a considerable distance, most pitiably torn. Johann Dola, a German soldier, was standing on the beach when several bombs plunged into the water beside him. A full 5 minutes passed before the bombs began to explode. Felt like the shocks of an earthquake, he remembered. In addition to showering the beach with sand and mud, the fragments and pieces of these bombs flew back and fell on the houses and buildings of the city, where they robbed many a brave soldier of his life and struck off his arm and leg. I had myself a piece of an exploded bomb in my hands, which weighed more than 30 pounds and was over 3 inches thick. Their homes rendered uninhabitable by the incessant fire, the citizens of Yorktown, along with the considerable number of British soldiers, fled in desperation to the beach, where they began to burrow into sandy cliffs. But there also they did not stay undamaged, Dola remembered, for many were badly injured and mortally wounded by the fragments of bombs which exploded partly in the air and partly on the ground, and their arms and legs severed or themselves struck dead. A few days before Cornwallis had decided to rid the army of its horses, unable to feed the animals and unwilling to give them up to the enemy, he ordered them slaughtered and dragged into the river. Initially, the hundreds of carcasses had washed out with the tide, but now they were back. Several days after their death, these poor animals came back in heaps. The Jaeger captain Johann Uld recounted. It seemed as if they wanted to cry out against their murder after their death. And by far the worst fate had been reserved for the army's former slaves, who had worked day and night building and repairing the British fortifications in anticipation of winning their freedom. Their rations reduced to virtually nothing, and without shelter from the enemy's fire, many had died in what the Virginia militia officer St. George Tucker described as the most miserable manner. The surviving African Americans' only consolation was that they still had the British fortifications between them and a return to slavery. But as they were about to discover, now that Cornwallis's army was running out of provisions, freedom was no longer an option. And so, throughout the book, Philbrick does an excellent job using firsthand, primary sources, firsthand accounts to describe what the different battles were like. I particularly like the one on Yorktown. This was, I thought, excellent. It builds this great visual for the battle. His best work may have been in the naval area with the Battle of Chesapeake and stuff like that. It's just not my cup of tea, and I didn't know which one to choose. But I do like reading about the Army and its works, and so I chose that one to read to you. One of the other parts of the book that I absolutely love with the Battle of Yorktown is the surrender scene, where Cornwallis has to suck up his pride and wave the white flag, and he struggled with that. And instead of, when the honorary thing is, or the honorable thing to do is go and surrender your sword to the opposing general, and when it came time to do that, Lord Cornwallis, of course, played it off as he was sick, so he sent his number 2 in charge of giving up the sword, General O'Hara. And when O'Hara gets there, of course, there's this disdain for the Americans, and as the British are marching down the road here to what they call now Surrender Field, and I've actually been there. I'd love to go back there. I went there when I was I think 15 years old, and I just didn't fully appreciate everything. But I can visualize this whole thing, and marching down the road, and the British are just not being very. The British soldiers are not being very honorable. But O'Hara, when he finally gets to the front, he's supposed to give up his sword to General Washington. He looks over to Rochambeau and is going to give it to the French general. And Rochambeau just kind of shakes his head and looks over at Washington. So when he turns to give it to Washington, Washington shakes his head and looks over at Benjamin Lincoln, his number 2. And so the number 2 has to surrender to the number 2. And it's very ironic because at this same time, Benjamin Lincoln is actually the guy who, at the battle or the siege of Charleston earlier, 2 years before this, I think? Can't remember the year, but anyway, 2 to 3 years before this, Lincoln was in charge of Charleston, South Carolina, when the British came in and laid siege, and he had asked for his soldiers to be released and to be able to leave with honor, and the British denied it. And so when Cornwallis asks for this at Yorktown, Washington denies it all. And how ironic that when O'Hara has to give up his sword, he has to give it up to Benjamin Lincoln, not George Washington. And so, anyway, just a lot of cool little stories going on along the way. I've always enjoyed those. I found that there was, towards the end of the book, Philbrick's talking about there's some ironies of winning liberty but denying it to the African Americans, and this included George Washington. So this brings me to, really one of the biggest problems I had with the book was, the subtitle is The Genius of George Washington, but throughout the beginning of the book, there is nothing that shows genius in George Washington. George Washington, instead of, wrapping his mind around going down to Virginia and trapping Cornwallis, he's got this idea stuck in his head that he's going to attack New York. He wants to take back New York, and he wants Rochambeau to join him in this. And Philbrick paints this picture that him and Rochambeau don't get along really all that well, other than they get along just because they're allies, but they don't necessarily get along in any other way. And other books that I've read kind of hinted that they were on much better terms than what Philbrick says. But anyway, Rochambeau withholds a lot of stuff from him about the French Navy. Philbrick goes into a lot of detail on, you've got these political things going on within the French Navy, but you've also got some geography issues. There's been some stuff going on down in the Caribbean, where there's been some storms that have been brewing, a hurricane hit, which is where the book gets its name, In the Hurricane's Eye. There was a big hurricane in the Caribbean that prevented the French from coming and saving the day earlier in the year, but there's just this distrust for Washington with the French. And he wants them to come in. He doesn't totally trust them that they're going to end up coming in because they just haven't done it yet. And anyway, getting back to the biggest problem I had was he says the genius of George Washington, but he shows absolutely no genius in the build-up to this battle. He doesn't do anything that would show genius. And if you're going to say the genius of George Washington in the victory of Yorktown, there should be some genius shown. All of the genius was basically shown by the French. Rochambeau, when he finally gets Washington to wrap his head around, we need to go south, and the opportunity is there. There's no genius shown, and the only genius that really Washington does show, Philbrick did not play up with. When he finally does wrap his head around that idea, Washington does do a bit of a genius job of putting together spies and leaking information so that it looked like he was building up and preparing to attack New York, whereas he was actually getting ready to head south. And some maneuvers that were really hard to hide from the British, he was able to hide until the last minute, and he used his spy network to drop information, and he left behind just enough soldiers to make that information look true. Philbrick, I didn't feel really played that up very much. That in itself is the real genius of George Washington, the use of his spy network at this point. And so I kind of had a problem with using this as the subtitle. The genius that he does point out is actually after the war, where Washington has to put out a lot of fires, so to speak. The Newburgh conspiracy, just different stuff like that, where he had to go settle the army down and make sure that they didn't revolt. And that was his true genius after. But that's after Yorktown, not during the Battle of Yorktown. It didn't have anything really to do with Yorktown. And so that was the real problem that I had. The positives, like I said earlier, the positives that Philbrick shows in this book are with the French Navy, the British Navy, the politics of it, the battles between the two, the geography and how geography really affected what happened out on the ocean. And again, my favorite chapter was probably chapters 9 and 10, where it talks about the Battle of Yorktown and the legacy of it. So I felt it was a good book, but it was not definitely not Philbrick's best necessarily. I did not like it as much as I liked In the Heart of the Sea. I did not like it as much as I liked The Mayflower. There's been some other ones that he's wrote. Those are the two popping in my head right now. So I would give this book a 4. Just because I would like to see more on the stuff with Yorktown, since it is kind of the main part or the main subject of the book. I would like to see a little bit more done with that. But I don't want that to downplay what he did with the Navy, because he did some awesome work talking about the ships and the commanders of these ships and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, BookTube, not to ramble for too long, but I hope that helps you in maybe deciding to pick up this book. I give it a 4. 4 out of 5 stars. Thank you for watching, and happy reading.